TeKaMoLo! Yes, I know it sounds like an insult. It sounds like something you might yell angrily at someone. Did you just cut me off? You drive like a TeKaMoLo! But it isn't. TeKaMoLo stands for Temporal, Kausal, Modal, Lokal. I've heard it referred to in English as temp, TMP, time, manner, place. What we're describing here is the preferred ordering of elements in the object part of a German language sentence. No, we're not talking about SVO, subject, verb, object. That's something else. And no, we're not talking about how verbs in German sentences tend to stick rather stubbornly in position 2 of the sentence. Although we will revisit that before the end of this episode. What we're describing here is if you have more than one element in the object part of your sentence, what order do those elements have to come in, or does it matter? Now, what is an element? Is an element a single word? Well, it can be, but elements are very often comprised of more than one word. Let's look at a simple example. Heinrich sees the girl. Subject, verb, object. In German, Heinrich sieht das Mädchen. The object part of the sentence is composed of 2 words. The definite article the, or das in German, and the noun girl, or Mädchen in German. That's one element. Das Mädchen is one element in that sentence. But if there's only one element in the object part of the sentence, then the ordering of elements is kind of irrelevant, right? But this is 2023. We are somehow entering the 3rd season of this YouTube channel. Who would have thunk we'd still be around? I think we are done with the Dick and Jane type introductory sentences. Let's move up to more ambitious content this year. The example sentence for today's episode is... I'm flying on an airplane next week to Berlin for my brother's birthday. My God, that's kind of an unwieldy sentence, but let's go with it because it happens to have 4 elements in the object part of the sentence, one for each of TeKaMoLo. So, let's get into it. First up is te. Te is short for temporal. That is of or relating to time. The question we're trying to answer here is when. When is the action in this sentence happening? When am I flying to Berlin? Well, I'm flying next week to Berlin. Okay, so we can start to build up the German translation of our sentence. Ich fliege nächste Woche. If your German sentence has a time specifier in it, then by and large, according to TeKaMoLo, it will come up front, right after the verb. There are exceptions to this, which we'll cover in this episode, but let's look at the standard case first. Ich fliege nächste Woche. Great. What's next? Next up is ka. Ka is short for causal. The related word in English is cause. The question we're trying to answer here is why? What is the cause of the action of this sentence? Why am I flying to Berlin? Well, I'm flying to Berlin for my brother's birthday. Okay. In German, you can say für den Geburtstag meines Bruders. That kind of matches the English. You can also say zum Geburtstag meines Bruders. Okay. Ich fliege nächste Woche zum Geburtstag meines Bruders. Great. So far, so good. Next up is mo. Mo is short for modal. The related word in English is mode. Think of a mode of transportation or a mode of operation. The question we're trying to answer here is how. How is the action in this sentence happening? How am I flying to Berlin? Well, I'm flying to Berlin on an airplane. Now, okay, let's pause there for a second. I know that saying I'm flying on an airplane is kind of redundant. If I say I'm flying to Berlin, it's kind of implied that I'm flying on an airplane. I mean, how else am I going to get there? It's not like I'm going to hitch a ride on the next blimp or hitchhike on a passing UFO. Of course I'm flying on an airplane. In real life, you'd probably omit that part from the sentence, but let's go with it for example purposes. Okay, so in German. Ich fliege nächste Woche zum Geburtstag meines Bruders auf einem Flugzeug. Great. That brings us to lo. Lo is short for locale. The related word in English is location. The question we're trying to answer here is where. Where is the action in this sentence happening? Where am I flying? Well, here's where it gets a little bit weird in both languages. In English, we say, I'm flying to Berlin. Note that we have to stick the directional preposition to in front of the destination. We can't just say, I'm flying Berlin. Okay, that's wrong, but why is it wrong? If I say I'm flying Berlin, it makes it sound as though Berlin is the direct object of that sentence, that Berlin is the person, place, or thing that I am flying. But that makes no sense, because Berlin is a city, and you can't fly a city. So, in English, we stick the directional preposition to in front of the destination to indicate that it's the indirect object of the sentence. It's the destination of my flying. Same thing in German, but it's a different preposition. The direct translation of to into German is zu, but you don't say ich fliege zu Berlin. That sounds wrong. For a named place like a city or a country, you use the preposition nach. Ich fliege nach Berlin. You can't say ich fliege Berlin in German for the same reason that you can't say I'm flying Berlin in English. It makes it sound as though Berlin is the direct object of that sentence, and it isn't. So, put it all together, and what do you get? Ich fliege nächste Woche zum Geburtstag meines Bruders auf einem Flugzeug nach Berlin. Oh mein Gott, das ist ja ein langer Satz. But it's good for example purposes. Now let's take a step back and look at English once again. How flexible are we with the word ordering in English? Oh, sorry, I should say, how flexible are we with the element ordering in English? It turns out we're pretty flexible. There's a bunch of different ways you can say this. I'm flying to Berlin next week on an airplane for my brother's birthday. I'm flying for my brother's birthday next week on an airplane. I'm flying to Berlin next week for my brother's birthday on an airplane. Whoops. What's wrong with that one? What's wrong with that one? Is that one wrong? It's not wrong, but that one is kind of ambiguous compared to the others. Let's take a look at this one. By putting the locale directly after the causal, it's no longer clear what the locale is modifying. If I say for my brother's birthday on an airplane, that could be one element in the German sentence, or in the sentence, I should say. Think about it. My brother could be having his birthday party in a themed restaurant that is built inside the fuselage of a decommissioned airplane. My brother's birthday could literally be happening on an airplane. So, for my brother's birthday on an airplane, at the end of the sentence like that is ambiguous. It could mean two different things. On an airplane could be modifying how I'm flying to Germany, or it could be modifying where the birthday is taking place. So you can see that in English, by putting the elements in the wrong order, even though each individual element is expressed correctly, when you put them together in the wrong order, you can say something that is either ambiguous, or in the worst case, something that sounds like gibberish. Something similar happens in German. When you're structuring the sentence, it's good to follow TeKaMoLo. Now, if you've really been paying attention in this episode so far, you will notice that there's a certain word I have not yet used to describe TeKaMoLo. That word is rule. The reason I haven't used that word is because TeKaMoLo is not a rule in the German language. It's more of a guideline or a set of suggestions. There are many exceptions to TeKaMoLo, and occasionally you will find sentences in German that seem to violate TeKaMoLo, and that's okay. There's exceptions to TeKaMoLo. Let's take a look at some of them. How flexible are we with the element ordering in German? Well, not as flexible as we are in English. You can't just shuffle them around. Ich fliege nächste Woche zum Geburtstag meines Bruders auf einem Flugzeug nach Berlin is the preferred ordering according to TeKaMoLo. If we switch that around, we can say something that sounds really strange. We can say, ich fliege nach Berlin nächste Woche zum Geburtstag meines Bruders auf einem Flugzeug. Each individual element is present, and each individual element is expressed correctly, but when you put them together in that order, it sounds like nonsense. It sounds like you just got hit on the head. Similar to in English, how we can express something in an ambiguous way with the elements in the wrong order. So we have to be careful, and it's a good idea to stick to TeKaMoLo when you're formulating a sentence in German, just to avoid that kind of confusion or ambiguity. Okay. Now, another option that exists in both languages is you can promote something to position 1 of the sentence. You do this in order to stress something. A very common usage of this in both languages is to move the time specifier to position 1. For example, let's say somebody comes up to me and says, oh, hey, I heard you're flying to Berlin next year for your brother's birthday, and I can pick up on the fact that they've got the time specifier wrong. So when answering that, I can say, next week I'm flying to Berlin on an airplane for my brother's birthday. I promote the time specifier to position 1. It stresses it a little bit. Notice that in English, everything else in the sentence just gets bumped down by 1 position. The rest of that sentence is in the same order as you would normally express it. It's just that I put something else into position 1. Great. A similar option exists in German, but it's handled slightly differently in German than it is in English. If I want to promote the time specifier or any other element to position 1 in German, note that the verb in German tends to stick rather stubbornly in position 2 of the sentence. So, nächste Woche fliege ich nach Berlin is how you would say I'm flying to Berlin next week, or next week I'm flying to Berlin. Notice that you don't say nächste Woche ich fliege nach Berlin. That's how you would say it in English. Next week I am flying to Berlin. But the verb in German cannot be pushed out of position 2, so whatever you push to position 1 pushes what used to be in position 1 to position 3, and everything after that gets bumped down by 1 position. This is subtly different to how we do it in English, but it's important, because the verbs in German sentences stick in position 2 unless you are giving an order or asking a question. Now note that there's limitations to this in English. In English, for whatever reason, we can't promote the destination to position 1. Why? I don't know. It just sounds wrong. To Berlin, I'm flying next week on an airplane for my brother's birthday. What? I mean, you'd probably be understood if you said it that way, but it sounds strange. Similarly, you wouldn't promote the modal to position 1, because again, it sounds strange. I mean, you could probably get away with this. You could say, on an airplane I'm flying next week to Berlin for my brother's birthday. Okay, it's clear what you mean, but that sounds kind of strange to me. But in German, it's no problem. Auf einem Flugzeug fliege ich nächste Woche zum Geburtstag meines Bruders nach Berlin. No problem. Now, one more option that exists in both languages is you can split an element into its own sentence clause. A very common usage of this is to split the causal, the reason for the action, into its own sentence clause. This cleans up the main clause a little bit, but it has another advantage which we're going to look at. So in English you might say, I'm flying next week on an airplane to Berlin, comma, In order to celebrate my brother's birthday. In order to can be shortened down to just to. I'm flying to Berlin next week, comma, to celebrate my brother's birthday. Okay, there's two usages of the word to in that sentence. The first one is a directional preposition. It indicates the indirect object or the destination of my flying. And the second to is a subordinated conjunction. It's short form for in order to. It introduces a separate sentence clause. Very similar option exists in German. Ich fliege nächste Woche auf einem Flugzeug nach Berlin, comma, den Geburtstag meines Bruders zu feiern. What is In English, is a it's a filler word that you say when you don't know what to say next. But in German, means in order to, or so that. It's a subordinated conjunction. It introduces a separate sentence clause. Now, the nice thing about moving one of these elements into its own clause is that we can now play with the order of the clauses relative to one another. We can start the sentence with the subordinate clause in both languages. In English, you can say, in order to celebrate my brother's birthday, comma, I'm flying next week on an airplane to Berlin. Same thing in German. Den Geburtstag meines Bruders zu feiern, comma, fliege ich nächste Woche auf einem Flugzeug nach Berlin. Note that again in German, if you move the subordinate clause to position 1, the verb stays in position 2. You don't say ich fliege, you say fliege ich. Man, there is a lot of forest fire smoke in the city today. There's a major forest fire in the central part of the province and we're getting the smoke hundreds of kilometers away. It's crazy. All right, pop quiz. Let's test your TeKaMoLo knowledge. If I wanted to say in German, I'm riding my motorcycle tomorrow to Edmonton for a meeting. How would I say that in German following the rules of TeKaMoLo? Hit the pause button if you need more time. Hit the pause button if you need more time. Okay, I'm sure most of you got the answer correct, but let's review. Ich fahre morgen wegen eines Meetings mit meinem Motorrad nach Edmonton. That is the straightforward TeKaMoLo version of that sentence. Now, there's a bunch of different options here. I'll give you bonus points if you moved something to position 1. Let's say the time specifier. Morgen fahre ich wegen eines Meetings mit meinem Motorrad nach Edmonton. It means the same thing. I'm just putting a little bit of stress or emphasis on the time specifier. Tomorrow is when I'm doing it. And bonus points if you split, let's say, the Kausal into its own sentence clause. Ich fahre morgen mit meinem Motorrad nach Edmonton, comma, wegen eines Meetings. Great. And bonus points if you put that subordinate clause first. Wegen eines Meetings, comma, fahre ich morgen mit meinem Motorrad nach Edmonton. It still works. And super extra bonus points if you moved something to position 1 that you wouldn't normally move to position 1 in English. Let's say the Modal. Mit meinem Motorrad fahre ich morgen wegen eines Meetings nach Edmonton. It still works in German. So, just to reiterate, TeKaMoLo is not a hard rule in the German language. There are many exceptions to it, some of which we've covered in this episode. You'll occasionally see sentences that don't follow TeKaMoLo. That's okay. But when you're forming a sentence in German, it's a very good idea to stick to TeKaMoLo for the object part of the sentence because it'll help avoid confusion or ambiguity. What do you think, Mr. Duck? I know it was, but I ran out of good weather. Hey, you watch your language. That's all for today. We will see you next time on Lernen und Fahren.